Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I had passed the old farmhouse a dozen times without giving it a second thought. It sat far back from the road, partially hidden behind rows of dead trees, its roof sagging, windows clouded with grime. There was a rusted gate, chained loosely, and a mailbox that leaned as if it were exhausted from standing too long. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see what was inside. The wind had picked up by the time I made it past the gate and approached the porch. Each step groaned under my weight, the wood soft from years of exposure. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swung open with a gentle push. The smell that hit me was a mix of mildew, dust, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the house was darker than I expected. Sunlight barely filtered through the filthy windows. The wallpaper had peeled away in strips, and the floors were coated in grime. But what struck me most was how it looked like someone had just left in the middle of their day. Dishes were still in the sink, a cup of cold coffee sat on a table, and an old rotary phone hung off its receiver on the wall. I moved cautiously through the living room, scanning every corner, listening for any signs of animals or squatters. Nothing. The quiet was absolute. I passed a dusty hallway mirror and caught my reflection distorted and murky. I felt a twinge of unease, but pushed forward, drawn to the back of the house. The kitchen was eerily intact. A faded calendar on the wall was stuck on April 1994. I opened a cupboard and found a row of canned goods, all expired decades ago. Then I noticed a door on the far side of the kitchen, barely visible behind a standing shelf that looked recently moved. It led to the basement. The door resisted at first, as if it didn't want to be opened. But with enough effort it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam weak but steady. The air grew colder as I stepped down, and the smell turned more pungent: old wood, rust, and something else I couldn't place. At the bottom of the stairs was a wide open space. Old furniture, broken appliances, and stacks of boxes filled the corners. I scanned the room slowly, and then the light landed on something strange. Against the far wall, there was a series of photographs taped to a corkboard. I walked closer, feeling a tightness in my chest with each step. The photos were all of people unsuspecting, candid shots. Some looked like they were taken from a distance, through windows or across parking lots. And one of them was me. It was taken from behind, likely on my walk home from work. My backpack, my jacket, even the way I turned my head slightly, it was unmistakable. I felt sick. I turned to leave, my breath coming faster, the flashlight trembling in my grip. That's when I heard a soft creak from above. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone else was in the house now. I stood frozen, listening, heart pounding in my ears. Another step, then another. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the basement into complete darkness, hoping whoever was up there wouldn't come down. I crouched behind a stack of boxes, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps continued, now closer to the basement door. The hinges groaned. I held my breath. But the steps didn't descend. Instead, they moved away, slow and heavy, until they disappeared altogether. I waited there, in the dark for what felt like an hour, straining to hear anything at all. Finally convinced the person had gone, I turned the flashlight back on and made my way quietly back up the stairs. The kitchen was empty. The house was silent again. I moved quickly through the living room and out the front door, not stopping until I was back at my car. I looked over my shoulder once, expecting to see someone in the window watching me, but there was nothing. Just the empty house. At home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, then pulled the curtains tight. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak in the walls made me sit up. Every shadow looked suspicious. The next day, I went back with a friend, hoping to show them the photos and prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when we arrived, the front door was sealed shut, and the place looked different. Almost staged. The dishes were gone, the calendar was gone, and in the basement, the corkboard was completely empty. No photos. No boxes. It was as if the house had been cleaned out in less than 24 hours. My friend didn't say much as we left. I could tell they thought I imagined it all. But I knew what I saw. I knew that photo of me was real. Story 2. The hospital had been abandoned for over 20 years, but locals still whispered about it. Stories floated around town of strange lights, of screams in the night, and of people who went exploring only to never return. I'd heard it all and brushed most of it off as urban legend. That's what I told myself as I stepped through the rusted side entrance, flashlight in hand and camera swinging from my neck. The air inside was damp and stale, thick with mold and decay. Broken gurneys littered the hallway, and faded warning signs hung loosely from the walls. Each footstep echoed louder than it should have, the sound swallowed strangely by the darkness. My breath fogged the air, though it was late spring and warm outside. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I moved slowly, taking pictures as I went. The walls were tagged with graffiti, layers of it, some faded and some recent. But what caught my eye were the symbols repeating patterns, crude and unsettling, like someone had scratched them into the paint over and over again. I didn't recognize them. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, and I'd explored plenty of abandoned places. The hospital's second floor was supposed to be the psychiatric wing. According to some online forums, that was where the worst of the stories came from. I debated staying on the ground floor, but curiosity won out. The stairwell was dark and narrow, filled with the smell of mildew and rust. As I climbed, the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, like the building itself was listening. At the top of the stairs, I found a wheelchair tipped on its side, wheels still intact and surprisingly clean. I stepped around it and entered a hallway lined with old patient rooms. The doors were open or hanging off their hinges, and inside were rotting mattresses, decaying furniture, and shattered glass. I kept my flashlight steady and moved forward, occasionally pausing to snap a photo. One of the rooms had its door completely intact, closed tight, with deep scratches gouged into the wood near the handle. I hesitated, then reached out and pushed it open slowly. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, the room was different, neater, somehow. There was an old bed frame, a rusted IV stand, and something else. On the floor, in the center of the room, lay a single Polaroid picture. I picked it up and examined it. The image was of the hallway I'd just come down, but it was taken from a higher angle, like from a security camera. I stared at it, heart pounding. In the photo, a figure stood behind me, tall, thin, cloaked in shadows. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, but the hallway was empty. I checked again, my pulse racing. Nothing. Shaking, I stuffed the photo into my pocket and backed out of the room. I no longer cared about documenting or exploring. I just wanted to leave. I retraced my steps down the hallway, but something was off. The graffiti I'd passed earlier was gone. The wheelchair was no longer in the hall. It was as if the building had rearranged itself. I moved faster, half running toward the stairwell, but when I got there, it wasn't the same one I'd climbed earlier. It led down into pitch black, deeper than it should have. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it to bring it back to life. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. I didn't look back. I bolted. The hallway twisted strangely, like the layout had changed completely. Doors lined both sides, some open and revealing more patient rooms, others shut tight. One door at the end stood open with a faint light spilling from it. I had no better option. I ran inside and slammed the door shut behind me, bracing it with a nearby chair. My breathing was ragged, hands trembling. Inside, the room was cleaner than the rest of the hospital, almost preserved. There were medical charts still on the wall and a stretcher in the center of the room. What drew my attention, though, was the wall of photographs. Dozens of Polaroids, all arranged in rows, each one showing a different person, men, women, some young, some old. They were all looking at the camera, and each had the same expression, fear. I scanned the wall and stopped when I saw a familiar face, my own. It was a shot from the stairwell, taken just moments before. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it died completely. The room plunged into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for my phone, but it wouldn't turn on. The light from the hallway vanished as the door creaked open behind me. Footsteps entered the room. I backed away slowly, bumping into the stretcher. I could feel the air grow colder, the presence of something just beyond reach. A whisper echoed through the room, low, unintelligible. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to focus, tried to make sense of it. The whispering grew louder, closer, circling me like a storm. Then, it stopped. I opened my eyes and the room was empty. My flashlight sputtered back to life, dim but working. The photographs were gone. The charts were gone. Even the stretcher had vanished. I was standing in a bare, crumbling room. The door was open, leading into a hallway I didn't recognize. But I didn't care anymore. I ran. I ran until I found the main floor, until I burst through the doors into the daylight. Story 3. The road leading to the building had nearly disappeared beneath overgrown weeds and cracked pavement. I parked my car on the shoulder and stared through the windshield at the crumbling structure ahead. The sign above the broken door was barely legible, its letters rusted and faded, but I could just make out the word, Crescent View. It had once been a nursing home, long abandoned and whispered about in town. No one had taken care of it in decades. Its windows were blackened with grime, some broken, others boarded shut. I'd always been drawn to forgotten places. There was something oddly peaceful about their silence. But as I approached the front door, a wave of unease washed over me, heavier than I'd expected. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a lobby frozen in time. Dust blanketed every surface. Wheelchairs sat abandoned in corners. The smell of mildew and rust lingered in the air like a memory no one wanted to remember. I stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath my feet. I had brought a flashlight, even though the sun was still out. The interior was dark, claustrophobic in its stillness. As I moved deeper into the building, I passed rusted call buttons on the walls and faded signage pointing to dining halls, activity rooms, and patient wings. Every hallway looked the same, long, narrow, and shadowed. Room doors were half open, as if someone had been about to leave but changed their mind. Some rooms still had beds with discolored sheets, chairs beside them knocked over or left turned toward the window. One room even had a stuffed animal resting on the pillow, untouched by time or dust. Then I found the stairwell. It was tucked behind a pair of heavy metal doors marked employees only. The doors groaned loudly as I pushed them open, the sound echoing down the narrow concrete stairs. I shined my flashlight downward. A faint chill wafted up from below, much colder than the rest of the building. Curiosity won over caution. I descended slowly, my footsteps loud in the silence. The stairs ended at a locked door, but when I turned the knob, it gave with little resistance. The hinges squealed, and I stepped into a basement level that felt much older than the floors above. The walls were bare cement, and the air was damp and metallic. There were storage rooms down there, rows of them, all with numbers painted on the walls. Some held rusted equipment and broken furniture. Others were completely empty. But at the end of the corridor, I found a single room with the door slightly ajar and the light on inside. That didn't make sense. I hadn't seen power anywhere else in the building. No lights had worked. Nothing had buzzed or hummed like it was receiving electricity. Yet that small room glowed softly under a flickering fluorescent bulb. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. It was an office, or at least it used to be. A metal desk stood against the far wall, a filing cabinet nearby with its drawers partly open. On the desk was an old TV set, the kind with dials and a rounded screen. The screen was on, showing static, and sitting next to it, a small stack of videotapes. My fingers trembled as I picked one up. It was labeled Patient 42, Final Observation. The rest had similar labels, Patient 43, 44, 45. A VCR sat under the TV, already powered on. I slid the tape into the slot and pressed play. The screen flickered, and for a moment I thought it was just more static. Then the image sharpened. A patient sat alone in a wheelchair, staring blankly at the camera. The timestamp on the bottom corner was dated 30 years ago. A voice from off-screen asked the patient a question, but the audio was distorted, muffled beyond understanding. The patient didn't respond. They just sat there, unmoving, as if frozen in place. After a few minutes, the footage cut to black, then restarted again, looping endlessly. I fast-forwarded. Nothing changed. Just the same silent figure, trapped in time. I pressed eject, heart pounding now, and picked up another tape. This one was labeled only with a single word, visitor. I hesitated, then slid it in. The screen showed what looked like the nursing home lobby, as it might have appeared before it fell apart. Lights worked. Plants were fresh. The front door opened, and a person walked in. It was me. Same jacket, same backpack, same flashlight. I backed away from the screen, heart slamming against my ribs. I hadn't seen any cameras. I hadn't known anyone was recording me. And yet there I was, entering the building just minutes ago. The footage followed me from room to room, angle to angle, as if someone had been watching the whole time. As if the building itself had eyes. I yanked the tape out and slammed it on the desk. My breath came fast now, panic bubbling up in my chest. I turned to leave and stopped cold. In the doorway stood a figure. It was the same patient from the first tape. Their face was pale and sunken, eyes clouded but focused directly on me. I froze, unable to move. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. The figure didn't speak. It just raised one hand and pointed back at the TV. I ran. I bolted out of the room, sprinting down the hallway, not daring to look back. The lights in the corridor flickered to life as I passed them, one by one. The doors to the storage room slammed shut behind me. The stairs felt impossibly long, my legs weak as I climbed them two at a time. I burst back into the upper level, gasping for air. The lobby looked different now. Cleaner, brighter. There was furniture I hadn't seen before. A woman in a nurse's uniform stood by the reception desk, head bowed as if reading something. When I called out to her, she didn't look up. Instead, she slowly turned and pointed toward the front door. I didn't hesitate. I ran for it, threw the door open, and stumbled into the fading daylight. The moment I stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind me, and every light inside the building went dark. The structure looked once again like the crumbling ruin I had first seen. I didn't look back. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without stopping. When I reached town, I pulled into the library and searched for old records on Crescent View. Most of the files had been removed or lost, but I found a newspaper article from 31 years ago. It spoke of a fire in the basement, said to have started from faulty wiring. Several patients died, but there was no official count. The home had shut down shortly after. There was one photo with the article. A grainy black and white image of a nurse at the reception desk. The same woman I had seen on my way out. No matter how many times I try to explain what happened, no one believes me. The building still stands, empty as ever. But I know it's not truly abandoned. Not really. Because some places remember. And some don't let go. Story 4. The old bowling alley sat on the outskirts of town, its once vibrant neon signs now flickering faintly in the distance, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I had heard rumors about it for years, how it had been abandoned for decades, left to rot and gather dust. The windows were boarded up, and the doors had been chained shut, but curiosity always had a way of pushing me toward places like this. One afternoon, when the air was thick with a hazy fog, I decided to find out for myself. I parked my car in the empty lot, the silence of the place weighing heavily on me. As I approached the side entrance, I noticed the chain that hung loosely around the door handle. It wasn't locked. I pushed the door open, the sound of creaking hinges echoing through the abandoned building. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and old wood. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The main room stretched out before me, the once bustling lanes now covered in a thick layer of grime. Broken light fixtures hung from the ceiling, their dull glow struggling to illuminate the emptiness. I walked down the aisles, my footsteps muffled by the decades of dust that had settled on the floor. The bowling balls, once a vibrant collection of colors, now lay scattered across the tables, their surfaces cracked and faded. The place felt frozen in time, as though no one had stepped inside in years. But then, as I walked past the lanes, I stopped dead in my tracks. One of the lanes was different. It was as if someone had just finished setting up for a game. The pins were perfectly aligned, standing tall and pristine, untouched by time. The lane gleamed under the dim light, a stark contrast to the rest of the dilapidated room. And at the front of the lane, sitting patiently, was a bowling ball, smooth, shiny, and freshly placed, as if waiting for the next player to roll it. I took a hesitant step closer, my heart rate quickening. The ball looked so out of place in the stillness of the room. It was a solid shade of deep purple, its glossy surface reflecting the dull light around it. It didn't look like any of the old, cracked bowling balls scattered across the tables. This one seemed almost new, but there was no way. The place had been abandoned for years, and no one had set foot here in as long as I could remember. So why was it so perfectly set up, as though someone was still in the middle of a game? I reached out to touch the ball, my fingers brushing against its cool surface. A shiver ran down my spine as I wondered how it had ended up here, in the middle of an abandoned alley. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the lanes, but there was only silence. Not even the usual creaks and groans of an old building. Just stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed thicker around me now, heavier. My pulse quickened as I took another step forward, drawn to the lane. There was a strange pull, as though the game was somehow still in progress, waiting for me to play. The more I stood there, the more it felt like I was intruding on something that had been left behind, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I looked back at the lane, wondering if it had always been this pristine. Had the pins always been perfectly lined up like this? I couldn't remember. Everything else in the building was falling apart, decaying under years of neglect. But here, this one lane seemed untouched, almost cared for. It was as though someone had been here recently, just moments ago. But who? Away. I turned my attention back to the ball. It was so perfectly placed, resting at the front of the lane, just waiting for someone to bowl. I reached down and picked it up, the weight of it surprising me. It felt solid, real, almost too real for something that had been left in an abandoned building. As I held it, I felt the faintest tremor in my hand. The room around me seemed to shift, the air grown colder, heavier, as if the building itself was reacting to the presence of the ball. Without thinking, I rolled it down the lane, watching as it glided smoothly over the polished wood. The ball seemed to move with purpose, as if it had a mind of its own. I stood there, watching it travel, feeling the strange tension in the air. It hit the pins with a satisfying clatter, knocking them down with perfect precision. The sound of the pins crashing to the ground was deafening in the quiet room, but it was the silence that followed that unsettled me. I stared at the pins, now scattered across the lane, as if the game had just concluded. But there was no one there to celebrate the strike. No cheering or laughter, just the sound of my own breath, heavy in the stillness. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Had I really just bowled a strike in an abandoned building? Or had I imagined it? I looked around the room once more, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There were no signs of anyone else being there, no footprints in the dust, no sounds of movement from another room. Yet something about the scene felt wrong, as though I wasn't alone. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the lane, and that's when I noticed that the ball had returned to the front of the lane. It was back in its original position, waiting for the next roll. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. The ball hadn't rolled back on its own. I was sure of it, but somehow it had returned to its starting position, just as if the game had continued without me. I could feel my breath quicken, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. The room, the lane, the ball, it was all too perfect, too staged. I didn't want to find out who or what had set up the game, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. As I backed away from the lane, I heard the faintest sound, the soft rolling of the ball on the wood. I turned to leave, but as I did, the ball rolled down the lane once more, hitting the pins with a quiet crash. And just like that, I knew whatever had been left behind here was far from gone. It was still waiting. Story 5. The abandoned elementary school loomed in the distance, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. I had been fascinated by the place ever since I first saw it from the road. It seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere, like a forgotten relic of a different time. The building was decaying, but there was something about it that called to me, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. I slipped through a gap in the wooden boards and entered through a back door that creaked under my weight. The air inside was musty, heavy with the scent of stale books and mildew. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor was covered with layers of dust and debris. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. It was as though the school had been abandoned mid-life, like someone had simply walked away and never returned. As I moved further inside, I noticed the hallways were lined with old classroom doors. Some of them were open, revealing dusty desks and forgotten chairs. Others were locked, their windows cracked or completely shattered. I couldn't help but wonder why this place had been left behind. There were no signs of vandalism, no broken windows or smashed lockers. It was as though time had simply frozen, leaving everything intact but completely still. I came across the teacher's lounge near the back of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from inside. Curiosity urged me to step closer, so I pushed the door open gently. The room was small, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It smelled like old coffee and stale air, but there was something oddly familiar about it, as though I had walked into a place that once held warmth and life. A small round table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Several coffee cups rested on the table, some half filled with dark liquid, others stained with dried remnants of old coffee. What struck me most were the lipstick marks on the rim of one of the cups, a faint red smear that seemed fresh. I leaned in closer, examining it carefully. There was no mistaking it, the stain was recent, not years old like the rest of the decay around me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Who had been here? Who had left this mark? The thought of someone else, someone living, having been in this place, left me with an uneasy feeling. I moved toward the corner of the room, where a small radio sat on a shelf. The soft hum of static filled the room, and for a moment I thought it was broken. But then the static shifted, and the sound of a faint voice came through. It was a local radio station, one that I recognized immediately, even though it had been shut down for years. The familiar voice of the late-night DJ filled the air, announcing weather reports and upcoming events, just like it had when the station was still active. I froze in place. How could this be? The station had gone off the air a long time ago, yet here it was, still broadcasting, still playing the same jingles and music that had long since disappeared from the airwaves. I glanced around the room, my mind racing. The coffee cups, the lipstick stain, the radio, it all felt wrong. Like I had stepped into a moment frozen in time, a moment that shouldn't exist. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time since entering the school, I felt like I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something was watching me. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the radio, half expecting it to cut out or for the voice to suddenly change. But it didn't. It kept playing, the same old songs and familiar announcements, like nothing had ever changed. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the room became unbearable. I turned away from the radio and looked around again. The table, the chairs, the half-eaten food left behind, it all seemed so real, so lived in. Yet there was no one here. No one but me. I moved to the window, trying to peer outside, but the glass was so dirty that I could barely make out anything beyond the building's cracked facade. The world outside felt distant, as though I had stepped into another time entirely, a place where the boundaries between past and present blurred together. I couldn't stay any longer. The eerie feeling had become too overwhelming, too suffocating. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I stopped. The radio was still playing, but the voice of the DJ had changed. It wasn't the late-night host anymore. It was a woman's voice, one that sounded strangely familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that it was the voice of someone I knew. A former teacher, one who had worked at this very school before it closed. Her voice was clear and warm, recounting memories of the students she had taught, the lessons she had shared. But then her tone shifted, becoming softer, almost wistful, as she spoke of the day the school had been shut down. I couldn't move. The voice seemed to echo through the room, resonating in my chest as though it was meant for me. I felt my pulse quicken, the air growing thicker as I stood there frozen. The radio crackled, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The static returned, and the music resumed as though nothing had happened. But it had. I was certain of it. I had heard her, and I could feel her presence in the room, as though she was still here, still waiting. I didn't dare linger any longer. I pushed the door open and rushed back into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps loud in the otherwise silent building. I didn't look back as I made my way to the exit. The coffee cups, the lipstick stains, the radio, they stayed with me, haunting me as I left the school behind. I didn't tell anyone what I had experienced, but I couldn't forget it. The teacher's lounge, the voice on the radio, it felt like a secret that was never meant to be uncovered, a moment frozen in time that refused to stay buried. Story 6. The old fairground had been abandoned for years, its once vibrant colors faded and replaced with the dull grays of neglect. The gates, rusted and half-fallen, creaked in the wind, but there was something about the place that drew me in. I had heard rumors about the fairground's mysterious past, how it had been shut down overnight after a series of accidents. But curiosity, as it often does, overpowered any sense of caution, and I found myself standing at the edge of the lot, staring at the overgrown pathways and the skeletons of old rides. I climbed over the broken fence, the metal scraping against my jeans. The air smelled of old wood, mildew, and the faintest trace of something metallic, almost like blood. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its towering frame now a tangle of twisted steel, the seats swaying gently in the breeze as if still waiting for passengers. I walked slowly toward it, my footsteps crunching over the scattered gravel. The fairground was eerily quiet, no birds, no sounds of life, just the whistling wind. As I wandered deeper into the heart of the fairground, my flashlight beam danced across long forgotten booths, their colors swallowed by the dark. The games were abandoned, the prizes long since taken or rotted away. There were signs too, their edges curling and peeling, advertising attractions that no longer existed. I couldn't help but feel a strange unease creeping over me, as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was then that I saw the security camera. Nestled on top of a wooden post, half hidden by vines and overgrowth, a small red light blinked steadily. My first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity. Why would a place like this still have a working camera? Who would be watching? But as I moved closer, I realized that the camera was pointed directly at the Ferris wheel. My heart skipped a beat as I wondered if someone was still using it to monitor the grounds. I stepped forward to get a better look, my curiosity now fully piqued. The camera seemed oddly well maintained considering the state of everything around it. It was old, yes, but it looked clean, with the red light blinking steadily in the darkness. I could see the faint outline of the Ferris wheel in the distance, and I felt an overwhelming urge to watch it, to see if anything was moving. That was when I noticed that something wasn't right. The Ferris wheel was turning. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a trick of the light, maybe. The wind was blowing, after all, and it wasn't out of the question that the old structure might creak or sway. But no, it wasn't the wind. The Ferris wheel was turning slowly, steadily, its creaky metal frame groaning in the silence. I could see the seats shifting, moving higher, then lowering, as if someone were riding in them. But there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat, my legs frozen to the spot. I turned back to the camera, its red light now feeling unnervingly like a warning. I could have sworn that the light had flickered for a moment, as if someone had just noticed me standing there. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to move toward the Ferris wheel, hoping it was just a mechanical glitch or some bizarre, explainable occurrence. But as I approached, the wheel didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It kept moving, as though it had a life of its own. The closer I got, the more I could feel a presence in the air, like something was watching me know, something was waiting. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch the rusty metal of one of the seats. It was cold to the touch, colder than I expected for an object left in the open for years. The faintest sound of laughter echoed through the air, distant and hollow, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I jerked my hand back, looking around wildly. I was alone. The only sounds were the creaking of the Ferris wheel and my own shallow breathing. I stepped back, but as I did, I noticed something even stranger. The camera, it was still blinking, but now it felt like it was moving, following my every step. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Was I imagining things? Had I triggered something? Was the camera tracking my movements? Without thinking, I turned and ran, not caring if the camera was still following me. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced through the fairground, the distant sound of the Ferris wheels creaking growing louder in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had been waiting for me to make a move. The eerie laughter seemed to grow, swelling until it was all I could hear. I stumbled past the old food stands, the rusted metal gates, the decaying remnants of carnival games. Every corner I turned felt like I was being herded, pushed toward the Ferris wheel, where I knew the camera was still watching. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence, that constant, blinking red light just behind me, like an eye that never blinked. By the time I reached the entrance again, I was out of breath, panic clawing at my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back at the broken fence, climbing over it once more, my hands slick with sweat. As I stumbled into the woods beyond the fairground, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. The Ferris wheel was still turning. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I avoided looking at any security cameras, avoided places that felt too familiar. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red light, blinking steadily, watching. I don't know what I disturbed in that place, but I knew one thing for sure: the fairground wasn't as abandoned as I thought. And the camera was still watching. Story 7. The farmhouse stood alone in a field of overgrown grass, its windows hollow and dark. I had come to document the eerie remains of the property, hoping to capture its history. The structure groaned in the wind, and every step I took on the warped floorboards sent echoes through the empty halls. Dust swirled in the light of my flashlight as I set up my camera in what used to be the living room. A broken couch sat against the far wall, its fabric torn and rotting. The silence felt heavy, like the house was waiting for something. As I reviewed my notes, the wind rattled the boarded-up windows. The old landline phone sat on a small wooden table, its cord cut and frayed. I ran my fingers over the dust-covered receiver, wondering when it had last been used. Midnight arrived, and the house seemed to settle into a deeper stillness. The sounds of crickets and distant owls faded as I adjusted the camera. I spoke into my recorder, detailing the farmhouse's past and its abandonment. At 2 a.m., the shrill ring of the disconnected phone cut through the silence. My heart lurched and I froze, staring at the impossible sight. The phone rang again, its sound tinny and hollow. I hesitated before reaching for the receiver, my breath unsteady. The moment I lifted it, a whisper slithered through the line. "Don't turn around." A chill ran down my spine as I held the receiver to my ear. The voice was barely audible, like someone speaking from a great distance. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. My body remained locked in place, fear tightening around me like a vice. The air behind me felt heavier, thick with something unseen. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the pounding of my heart. The whisper returned, softer this time. "They don't like it when you look." My pulse roared in my ears, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I forced myself to breathe, the weight of the phone growing unbearable. The floor behind me creaked, the sound deliberate, measured. My fingers trembled as I slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. The air grew colder, my breath now visible in the dim light. The walls seemed to press inward, the house suddenly suffocating. The thought of turning around sent a wave of nausea through me. Another creak came, closer this time. I clenched my jaw, my body refusing to move. The feeling of something just behind me made my skin prickle. Summoning every ounce of control, I reached for my camera without turning. My fingers fumbled as I switched it on, the lens aimed at the wall ahead. I hit record, hoping it would capture whatever stood behind me. A soft rustling sound filled the room, like fabric brushing against wood. I gritted my teeth, my grip on the camera tightening. The presence behind me lingered, unmoving but undeniably there. The whisper came again, a breath against my ear. "Leave." The word barely carried through the air, but the warning was clear. My legs finally obeyed, and I stepped forward without looking back. My movements were slow, deliberate. Each footstep felt agonizingly loud against the wooden floor. Reaching my equipment bag, I bent down carefully, keeping my gaze fixed ahead. The moment I touched the strap, a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I bit the inside of my cheek, forcing myself to remain calm. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. I took another step, my knees nearly giving out. The silence stretched, but the presence behind me never wavered. I reached the doorway, my hands clammy as I gripped the frame. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted, the weight lifted, and the suffocating cold eased. A shaky breath left my lips as I grabbed my keys from the counter. I didn't dare check my camera just yet. My only goal was to leave that farmhouse as quickly as possible. I stepped outside, the night air sharp against my face. My car sat at the end of the dirt path, its presence a relief. I moved quickly, my pulse still erratic. As I reached for the door handle, the house groaned behind me. I stopped, unwilling to turn around. The sensation of eyes on my back returned, stronger than before. Forcing myself to stay composed, I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dark. The farmhouse loomed in my rearview mirror, a shadow against the night sky. I pressed my foot to the gas, my only thought to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. The road stretched ahead, empty and unwelcoming. My camera sat beside me, the footage waiting to be reviewed. When I finally reached a motel an hour away, exhaustion crashed over me. I locked the door behind me, double-checking every window. Only then did I take a deep breath and pick up the camera. My fingers hesitated before pressing play. The screen flickered to life, showing the empty room from earlier. I watched myself freeze as the phone rang, my expression barely visible in the dim light. Then, behind me, something moved. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the darkness, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood inches from me, unmoving, its hollow eyes locked onto my back. My breath hitched as I watched myself reach for the phone. The figure leaned in, its mouth inches from my ear. The moment I answered, its lips parted, and though no sound came from the video, I knew what it had said. My shaking hands fumbled to turn off the camera. My reflection in the dark screen stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I didn't sleep that night, and I never returned to that farmhouse again. Story 8. The asylum stood at the edge of town, a decaying monument to the past. Its windows were shattered, its walls covered in layers of graffiti, each tag and symbol telling a different story. The air smelled of mold and dust, the remnants of a forgotten place left to rot. I stepped through the rusted entrance, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The floor beneath me was littered with debris, broken tiles, empty cans, and the occasional piece of torn fabric. Each step echoed down the empty corridors, making the silence even more oppressive. I had heard rumors about the place, whispered warnings from other urban explorers. Some said people had gone missing here. Others swore they had seen movement in the windows at night. I had dismissed the stories, convinced they were nothing more than myths meant to scare people away. As I moved deeper into the asylum, my eyes scanned the walls for anything interesting. Faded patient charts still clung to bulletin boards, their ink smudged and unreadable. The graffiti was what fascinated me most: names, strange symbols, and crude images that told a story of those who had come before me. One message stood out from the rest, the paint looking fresher than anything else around it. It read, "He's still here." The words were uneven, hastily written, as if whoever had left them had been in a hurry. A shiver crawled up my spine as I reached out and traced the letters with my fingers. Before I could dwell on it, a door creaked open down the hall. The sound was slow and deliberate, the kind that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, listening for any other noise. I turned my flashlight toward the hallway, its beam illuminating the peeling wallpaper and exposed wires hanging from the ceiling. The door at the far end was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if disturbed by an unseen force. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The door led to what must have once been an office, the furniture overturned and covered in dust. A single chair sat upright in the center of the room, facing me as if expecting my arrival. I hesitated before stepping inside, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air felt different here, heavier, as if the room itself was watching me. Papers were scattered across the floor, their edges curled with age. One stood out among the rest, its ink surprisingly clear. "Don't look for him." A sudden movement in the doorway sent me stumbling back. My flashlight flickered, the beam shaking as I aimed it at the entrance. For a split second, I swore I saw a shadow shift just beyond the threshold. I forced myself to take slow breaths, steadying my nerves. It was probably just my imagination, tricks of light and shadow playing with my mind. I repeated the thought in my head, trying to convince myself as I backed out of the room. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching into darkness that felt more suffocating than before. The air had turned cold, my breath visible in the dim glow of my flashlight. Each step I took felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing against me. I passed the graffiti message again, the letters seeming darker now, almost as if they had deepened in the brief time I had been away. The sensation of being watched was stronger, an invisible weight settling on my shoulders. I clenched my jaw, moving faster toward the exit. A sudden bang echoed from behind me, a door slamming shut with force. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the corridor, but there was nothing, just the same empty hallway, the same peeling walls. My pulse raced as I forced myself to keep moving. The asylum felt different now, the silence more suffocating, the darkness more complete. The stories I had dismissed as myths crawled back into my mind, their warnings whispering at the edges of my thoughts. I needed to get out, and fast. As I neared the entrance, I heard another sound, softer this time, a slow, deliberate breath coming from somewhere behind me. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run. I turned, my flashlight catching movement in the corner of my vision. A figure stood at the end of the hall, shrouded in shadows, its form barely distinguishable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching me. My grip tightened on my flashlight, my breath coming in short gasps. I took a single step back, my foot crunching against broken glass. The sound echoed through the corridor, bouncing off the walls like a warning. The figure remained motionless, an eerie presence that sent ice through my veins. I didn't wait to see if it would move. I turned and sprinted toward the exit, my feet barely touching the ground. The halls blurred around me, the walls seeming to close in as I pushed forward. My heart pounded against my ribs, adrenaline fueling my escape. The moment I burst through the entrance, the air outside felt impossibly fresh. I stumbled forward, gasping for breath, my legs shaking beneath me. The asylum loomed behind me, dark and silent, its secrets locked away once more. I turned back, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. But there was nothing, just the empty hall beyond the entrance, swallowed by shadows. The feeling of being watched never faded, lingering like a weight pressing against my back. I didn't look back again. I kept moving, forcing myself toward my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, the sound grounding me in reality. I sped away, the asylum shrinking in my rearview mirror. I told myself I wouldn't return, that I had seen enough. But as I lay in bed that night, sleep eluding me, I couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes watching from the dark corners of my room. And somewhere, deep in the silence, I swore I heard a door creak open once more. Story 9. The dirt road leading to the abandoned film set was overgrown, the trees stretching their limbs toward each other as if trying to seal off the path. My friend Ethan drove slowly, the tires crunching over dried leaves and twigs. The entrance was marked by a rusting metal gate, leaning off its hinges as if daring us to step inside. Beyond the gate, the remnants of the movie set stood eerily still. Wooden facades of old Western-style buildings loomed in the clearing, their paint peeling and windows shattered. A saloon, a general store, and a sheriff's office lined the dirt road, frozen in time like a forgotten ghost town. We stepped out of the car, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. The wind whistled through the hollowed-out structures, creating a faint moaning sound. As we walked further in, we noticed old props scattered about, wagon wheels, broken barrels, and even a dusty rocking chair swaying slightly. Ethan nudged my arm and pointed ahead. A long wooden table stood outside the saloon, covered in plates and utensils, as if someone had just left in a hurry. My stomach tightened when I saw steam rising from a plate of roasted chicken, the scent unmistakably fresh. We exchanged uneasy glances, the silence between us heavier than before. There were no cars, no signs of recent visitors, yet the food was still warm. I reached out hesitantly, touching the edge of a plate. It was real, not part of some leftover prop. Ethan leaned in closer, inspecting a half-empty glass of water. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who would come all the way out here just to eat?" A sudden rustling sound came from inside the saloon, making us both freeze. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the dark doorway, half expecting to see someone step out. The swinging doors creaked, moving slightly as if stirred by a passing presence. Ethan gestured for me to stay back while he stepped forward. He pushed the doors open, peering into the dim interior. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the stillness within. I took a cautious step inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. Dust motes floated in the light filtering through broken windows, casting eerie patterns on the wooden floor. The bar counter was lined with empty bottles, and a faded menu hung crookedly on the wall. Then I noticed footprints in the dust, fresh and distinct. They led from the counter to a door at the back of the saloon, disappearing into the shadows. My heart pounded as I nudged Ethan, pointing them out. He swallowed hard, following the trail with his eyes. "Someone's been here. Recently." His voice was strained, his usual confidence wavering. "But where are they now?" A loud thud echoed from upstairs, sending a jolt through both of us. We turned our heads toward the wooden staircase, the steps worn and splintered with age. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, stretching long and heavy. Ethan exhaled slowly, gripping the railing as he started up. I followed, each step groaning beneath our weight. At the top of the stairs, a hallway extended into darkness, doors hanging slightly ajar. We moved cautiously, peering into each room. Most were empty, filled with tattered furniture and discarded props. The one room at the end of the hall had its door shut tightly, as if someone had deliberately closed it. Ethan reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before twisting it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a small bedroom with a neatly made bed. A candle flickered on the nightstand, its wax dripping onto the wooden surface. A single chair sat near the window, and on it lay a leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with hurried, slanted writing, the ink smudged in places. Ethan picked it up, flipping through the entries, his brow furrowing. "These dates," he muttered, showing me a page. "These entries are recent, from this week." My stomach twisted as I scanned the words, descriptions of watching the woods, of expecting company, of preparing a meal. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. "They knew we were coming," I whispered, the realization sinking in. "But how?" A floorboard creaked behind us, and we both whipped around. The doorway stood empty, but the candlelight flickered wildly, as if disturbed by movement. My skin prickled as I scanned the dim room, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Ethan grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the door. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. We hurried down the stairs, our footsteps echoing through the hollowed-out building. As we burst outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the set. The table of food was untouched, exactly as we had left it, but the air felt different, heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching our every move. We rushed toward the car, our breaths ragged. Ethan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. Just as we climbed inside, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure standing at the saloon's doorway. My breath hitched as the figure remained perfectly still, just watching us. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew whoever they were, they had been waiting. Ethan slammed the car into reverse, tires kicking up dust as we sped down the dirt road. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the only sound a rumbling engine and the distant rustling of the wind. Finally, Ethan exhaled shakily. "We are never coming back here," he said, gripping the wheel tightly. I nodded, still staring out the window as the abandoned set disappeared into the trees. The unease lingered in my chest, an unshakable feeling that we had intruded on something we were never meant to see. And whoever had been watching us, they weren't finished yet. Story 10. I had been hiking alone for most of the afternoon, following a barely visible trail through dense forest. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then, through a break in the trees, I spotted something unexpected, a clearing with abandoned tents and camping gear scattered about. Stepping closer, I noticed the campsite looked as if it had been left in a hurry. Plates with half-eaten food sat on logs around a fire pit, now cold and covered in ash. Backpacks remained unzipped, their contents spilling onto the ground as if someone had been searching for something. A strange unease settled over me as I inspected the area. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, and no indication of where the campers had gone. It was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air, leaving their belongings behind like forgotten relics. I took another step, and a soft crunch beneath my boot made me freeze. Looking down, I saw a flashlight lying in the dirt, its lens cracked. When I picked it up, the plastic casing was warm to the touch, as if someone had been holding it not too long ago. A rustling sound came from the trees beyond the campsite, snapping me out of my thoughts. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the noise, scanning the dense foliage. Shadows shifted between the trees, too large and deliberate to be the wind. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The forest swallowed my words, offering no response. My gut told me to leave, but curiosity held me in place, my eyes fixed on the shifting darkness beyond the camp. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I took a cautious step back, my breath shallow. Then, without warning, something darted between the trees, a blur of movement too quick to make out. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my own flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the edge of the trees where the movement had been. Nothing was there, but the feeling of being watched crawled over my skin like unseen hands. I turned back to the abandoned campsite, scanning it one last time. The firewood was neatly stacked, a jacket hung over a branch, and a book lay open on a fold-in chair, as if its reader had only stepped away for a moment. But no one had returned, and I doubted they ever would. Then, from the tree-ling, a whisper carried through the still air. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent ice down my spine. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there, watching me. I backed away slowly, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices rising and falling like an unseen conversation. The sound came from all directions, surrounding me like an invisible crowd. With every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned and hurried down the trail. The whispering followed, threading through the trees, moving faster than I could. The path twisted and narrowed, my boots slipping on damp leaves as I forced myself forward. A sudden weight slammed into my back, sending me sprawling to the ground. My flashlight skidded away, its beams spinning wildly over the trees. I scrambled to my feet, but nothing was there, no sign of what had knocked me down. Panting, I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it wildly, searching for any sign of movement. The woods were empty, but the whispering had stopped. The silence was somehow worse, thick and suffocating. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I ran. The path ahead felt endless, the trees towering on either side like silent sentinels. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see or what I wouldn't. Minutes stretched into an eternity before I finally reached the edge of the forest. My car sat where I had left it, the sight almost unreal after what I had just experienced. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. Locking the doors, I took a shaky breath and dared one last glance at the tree line. The campsite was hidden from view, but something else caught my eye. A figure stood among the trees, barely visible in the fading light. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. I didn't wait to see if it would step closer. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. With one final glance at the darkened forest, I drove away, leaving the hidden campground and whatever haunted it behind. Story 11. The air was stale as I stepped into the bunker, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick dust hanging in the air. The concrete walls were lined with rusted metal pipes, and the floor was littered with debris from years of abandonment. The moment I took another step forward, the heavy steel door behind me slammed shut with a deafening clang, making my heart jolt in my chest. I spun around and grabbed the handle, yanking hard, but it wouldn't budge. The weight of silence pressed down on me, broken only by my own breathing. Just as I was about to collect myself, a faint scuffling noise echoed from deeper inside the bunker, making my skin crawl. My flashlight flickered as I turned, shining it down the long, dark corridor ahead. The walls were covered in peeling paint and faded warning signs, their words too worn to read. Another sound came, this time closer, like the shuffle of footsteps on concrete. I steadied my breath and forced myself to move forward, gripping the flashlight tighter. The tunnel stretched endlessly before me, the air growing colder with each step. A faint metallic smell lingered, and I had the distinct sensation of being watched. A rusted metal door on my left creaked open slightly as I passed, and I jumped back, my pulse hammering. I shined the light inside, revealing a small room filled with scattered equipment and an overturned chair. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, as though someone had walked through recently. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the corners for any sign of movement. A row of metal lockers stood against the wall, their doors ajar. As I reached out to inspect one, a loud bang echoed from the corridor, and I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The sound had come from further down, where the darkness seemed thicker. I hesitated, then stepped out of the room, my footsteps careful against the cold concrete. The air was heavier now, carrying the faintest whisper of something unseen. A guttural scrape echoed from the far end of the hall, followed by a breathy exhale that made my stomach drop. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move forward. The hallway branched off in two directions, both shrouded in darkness. I picked the left path, moving slowly as my flashlight illuminated the crumbling walls. A rusted sign hung crookedly near a door, the words barely legible, "Control Room." The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness waiting beyond. I pushed it open carefully, revealing a cluttered space with old monitors and broken keyboards. A thick layer of dust coated the surfaces, but the air carried the faint scent of something recent, something alive. My flashlight beam landed on a set of fresh footprints in the dust, leading deeper inside. I followed them with reluctant steps, my heartbeat in my ears. The footprints stopped abruptly near a darkened corner, as if whoever left them had vanished. A metallic creak made me turn just in time to see a cabinet door swing open on its own. I took a step back, gripping my flashlight with sweaty fingers. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, from inside the cabinet, came the unmistakable sound of slow, measured breathing. A chill ran through me, but I forced myself to move. I reached out, gripping the edge of the cabinet door, and yanked it fully open. The light revealed nothing but empty darkness, the space inside too shallow for anyone to hide. I exhaled shakily and turned away, but the moment I did, I heard it again breathing, this time directly behind me. My body seized with fear as I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. A sudden crash from the hall sent my nerves into overdrive, and I bolted from the control room. My footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence, the bunker seeming to close in around me. I had to find another way out before whatever was in here found me first. I ran until I reached another steel door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, leading into a larger chamber lined with rusted machinery. The air here was thick with the scent of decay, and something dripped from the ceiling in slow, deliberate drops. I forced myself forward, scanning the room for another exit. A grated vent sat near the far wall, partially unbolted. It was small, but I could squeeze through if I had to. As I knelt to pry it open, a shadow shifted in the periphery of my vision. I snapped my head up, but nothing was there. My pulse thundered as I turned back to the vent, forcing my fingers under the edge to lift it. A metallic groan echoed through the space, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I scrambled into the vent, my body barely fitting as I pulled myself through. The darkness swallowed me whole, but I kept moving, inching forward as the sound of dragging footsteps grew closer. The metal walls of the vent vibrated with each hurried breath I took. I turned a corner, my fingers slipping against the dust-coated surface. Then, just as I was about to push forward, a hand shot through the slats behind me. I kicked wildly, my foot connecting with something solid, and the hand withdrew with a guttural growl. Heart hammering, I crawled faster, the vent sloping downward into the unknown. My flashlight flickered again, casting eerie shadows ahead. The vent opened into another corridor, this one lined with old bunk beds and broken lockers. I pulled myself out, collapsing onto the cold floor as the metal above groaned ominously. I had to keep moving. A soft whisper drifted through the air, the words unintelligible but unmistakably human. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, only to see a figure standing at the end of the corridor, motionless. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its features obscured by the dim light. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching. I took a cautious step back, but as I did, the figure took a step forward. Panic surged through me, and I turned, running blindly through the maze of corridors. Every twist and turn felt endless, my breath ragged in the confined space. Then, up ahead, I saw a ladder leading up to a rusted hatch. I lunged for it, climbing as fast as my shaking limbs allowed. The sound of footsteps below grew faster, closer. I reached the hatch, slamming my shoulder against it until it groaned open. Cold air rushed in as I pulled myself up, the bunker's darkness stretching below. I barely had time to slam the hatch shut before something below reached for me. My hands fumbled with the latch, locking it just as a force slammed against the metal. I stumbled away, gasping, the night air sharp in my lungs. The old bunker loomed beneath me, its secrets sealed in the darkness below. Whatever was in there had almost kept me, but I wasn't about to look back. I turned and ran, leaving the bunker and its unseen inhabitant far behind. Story 12. Crawling through the narrow tunnel, I moved carefully, my hands pressing against the damp concrete. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and old earth, making each breath feel heavy. My flashlight flickered, casting shaky beams against the walls, revealing rusted pipes and graffiti that hadn't seen daylight in years. I wasn't sure how far I had gone, but the tunnel twisted and turned, swallowing any sound beyond my own movements. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt, as if something unseen was watching me. The tunnel had once been part of an old sewer system, abandoned decades ago, yet signs of recent activity lingered. A mattress lay pushed against one side of the passage, surrounded by empty food cans and crumpled wrappers. Someone had been staying here, their makeshift shelter hidden deep beneath the city. The sight made my stomach tighten, but before I could process it, I heard footsteps echo ahead. I froze, my heartbeat hammering in my ears as a shadow stretched across the tunnel wall. A pair of feet stepped into view, inches from the beam of my light. Whoever it was had stopped just ahead, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Swallowing hard, I turned off my flashlight, plunging the space into near darkness. My breath came shallow as I tried to listen over the distant sound of dripping water. The figure ahead shifted, and the faintest scrape of a shoe against concrete made my skin crawl. I considered turning back, but the tunnel behind me stretched into unknown darkness. If I moved now, I'd make noise, and I had no idea if whoever was ahead had already seen me. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, debating whether to use it as a weapon if necessary. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds, it was impossible to tell in the pitch-black space. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, but this time they were moving toward me. Panic surged through my chest as I scrambled backward, my shoulder slamming against the cold wall. The sound of breathing reached me, low and steady, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, desperate to retreat, but the tunnel was narrow, making it difficult to move quickly. My palms skidded over the rough surface as I tried to push myself away, my mind racing with what I might be up against. A sudden whisper cut through the darkness, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It was a single word, drawn out in a hushed voice that sent ice through my veins. I couldn't make out what was said, but it came from just feet away. I flicked the flashlight back on, aiming it forward, and the beam caught movement just before it went out again. The batteries had died, leaving me trapped in suffocating darkness. My fingers fumbled for the spare in my pocket, but my hands were trembling too much to work fast enough. Something moved closer, the shuffle of fabric against the walls confirming my worst fear. I bolted, crawling as fast as I could, scraping my knees and palms against the unforgiving ground. My breath came in sharp bursts as the space ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. I could hear the footsteps following, unhurried but deliberate, as if whoever was behind me knew I had nowhere to go. My pulse pounded in my skull as I pushed forward, my only thought being to escape. The tunnel split ahead, a passage leading sharply to the right, and I veered into it without hesitation. The air in this section was colder, a musty, stagnant smell pressing against my face. I reached out blindly, feeling for anything that could guide me forward. A sudden clatter behind me told me that my pursuer had also entered this part of the tunnel. Gritting my teeth, I forced myself to keep moving, trying to suppress the rising panic. The walls felt tighter, the ceiling lower, forcing me to duck even further. I had no idea where this passage led, but the thought of stopping wasn't an option. A faint light appeared ahead, a tiny break in the darkness that I fixated on like a lifeline. I crawled faster, my muscles burning as my hands scraped against something sharp. The sound of movement behind me had slowed, but I wasn't willing to stop and find out why. As I neared the light, the passage narrowed even further, forcing me to squeeze through. The source of the glow was a small opening, barely large enough to fit through. I could see rusted metal bars ahead, some bent just enough to create a gap. Wasting no time, I pulled myself through, my shirt catching on jagged edges as I forced my body forward. My shoulders ached, but I pushed past the pain, feeling the rough surface tear at my skin. The space widened just enough for me to tumble out onto solid ground. I gasped for air, rolling onto my back as my chest heaved. The dim light came from an old maintenance room, its walls covered in peeling paint and rusted tools. I looked back at the tunnel entrance, expecting to see movement, but the darkness remained undisturbed. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. That fear had made me hallucinate the footsteps and whispers. But then, deep within the tunnel, a shadow moved, just beyond the reach of the dim light. It lingered for a moment before disappearing, leaving nothing but silence behind. I forced myself to my feet, legs shaking beneath me. There was an old exit door at the far end of the room, its rusted hinges barely holding it in place. Without hesitation, I staggered toward it, pushing it open with all my strength. The door groaned, but it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward. Each step felt like a struggle, my body aching from the frantic escape. As I reached the top, I shoved open the last barrier between me and the outside world. Fresh air hit my face as I stumbled into the night, the city lights stretching out before me. The familiar hum of distant traffic filled my ears, grounding me in reality. I turned back once, staring at the darkened entrance behind me, half expecting to see someone emerge. Nothing moved, but the weight of unseen eyes still pressed against me. Whoever had been in that tunnel hadn't followed me out, but I knew they were still down there, watching, waiting. I walked away without looking back, determined to never return. But as I moved through the city streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. Some things, once found, never really let go. Story 13. The train station had been abandoned for decades, its rusted tracks and broken windows standing as remnants of another time. I had always been drawn to forgotten places where history lingered in the air like a ghost. That night I found myself standing before the old station, its entrance yawning open like a mouth inviting me inside. I stepped onto the platform, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air smelled of damp wood and rust, and the dim moonlight filtered through the shattered roof. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my presence, and I felt an uneasy chill run down my spine. Then, the intercom crackled to life, a distorted hum breaking the quiet. At first, it was nothing but static, a garbled mess of sound. But then, through the interference, I heard my name, whispered as if from lips just behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The platform was empty, the shadows stretching long under the flickering remnants of the station's old lights. My name had been spoken, of that I was certain, but there was no one else here. The speakers crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer, more insistent. It called my name, slow and deliberate, each syllable drawn out like a warning. I backed away from the edge of the platform, my pulse hammering in my ears. A gust of wind blew through the station, sending a shiver down my spine. The train schedule board, long forgotten, creaked as it swayed slightly. Something about the air changed, then growing heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. I turned to leave, my instincts screaming that I had overstayed my welcome. But as I took a step toward the exit, a soft chime echoed through the air. The unmistakable sound of a train approaching filled the station. I froze, staring down the dark tracks. There was no way a train could be coming. This place had been decommissioned years ago. Yet in the distance, a single beam of light appeared, growing brighter by the second. The rails trembled beneath my feet, vibrating with an approaching weight. The wind picked up, carrying with it a deep, resonant hum. The train was getting closer, but there was still no sign of it beyond the growing light. The intercom crackled again, this time with static so sharp it made my ears ache. My name was whispered once more, but this time it wasn't alone. A chorus of hushed voices joined in, layering over each other in an eerie symphony. Panic gripped me, and I bolted for the exit. The floor felt uneven beneath me, as if the very foundation of the station was shifting. The air grew thick, heavy with something unseen but undeniably present. Just as I reached the doorway, the station lights flickered violently. A screeching sound filled the air, metal grinding against metal. I turned for one last look and saw the train materializing from the darkness, its windows dark and empty. The train slowed as it reached the platform, coming to a halt with an unsettling stillness. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a pitch-black interior. An icy dread washed over me as I realized that the voices had stopped. The silence was suffocating. I stood frozen, unable to move, staring into the gaping doorway. There was no conductor, no passengers, only an invitation into something I knew I shouldn't enter. A single breath of cold air swept past me, carrying a faint whisper against my ear. "Get on." The voice was not coming from the speakers anymore. It was closer, just behind me. I turned sharply, but no one was there. The air had grown impossibly still, as if the entire world had ceased moving. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought against the instinct to run. Then the train doors began to close, and for a brief second, I saw something shadowed figures standing inside. Their faces were obscured, but I felt their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The doors sealed with a final hiss, and the train shuddered as it started moving again. The light from the engine faded into the darkness, and within moments it was gone. The station fell silent once more. I staggered backward, my breath ragged. The air felt lighter now, as if whatever presence had been here had departed with the train. The station was just an empty ruin again, as lifeless as it had been when I first arrived. Without another thought, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was far from the station, its looming structure swallowed by the night. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I never returned to that place, but sometimes in the dead of night I hear it again. The crackling of an old intercom, the whisper of my name, and somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a train that should not exist. Story 14. The amusement park was hidden deep in the woods, its existence unknown to most. I stumbled upon it while hiking, my curiosity piqued by the rusted archway barely visible through the dense trees. The air inside felt different, heavy with the scent of decay and damp metal. Vines wrapped around the skeletal remains of roller coasters, and the faded banners swayed in the breeze. Walking further in, I noticed the Ferris wheel standing tall, its metal frame corroded but still intact. The gondolas hung like forgotten relics, their paint chipped and peeling. Despite the eerie silence, the park felt strangely preserved. as if waiting for someone to return. I took slow steps toward the Ferris wheel, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet the only sound. A small control booth stood nearby, its door hanging off the hinges. Inside, dust covered the controls, but the buttons remained visible. My fingers hovered over them, but I hesitated, wondering if the ride could still work. As I turned away, a faint creak sounded, and the Ferris wheel groaned to life. I stepped back, watching as the wheel rotated ever so slightly. It moved in sluggish, jerky motions, as if shaking off years of stillness. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, but I was completely alone. The thought of a working Ferris wheel in an abandoned park sent a chill through me. Despite my unease, I couldn't resist the urge to step inside one of the gondolas. The door creaked as I pulled it open, and I settled onto the worn seat. As soon as I sat down, the Ferris wheel began to move, the motion unsettling in its unnatural smoothness. I gripped the sides, my breath hitching as I slowly ascended. The higher I went, the more of the park I could see. The skeletal remains of the rides cast long shadows in the fading light, giving the place a ghostly appearance. I tried to convince myself that the controls had malfunctioned, that this was some fluke of forgotten machinery, but the deeper feeling inside me whispered otherwise. Halfway up, the ride jolted, causing the gondola to sway violently. I gasped, holding on tightly as the structure groaned under the movement. Below, the park remained still, as if watching me. The ride continued its slow ascent, and I felt trapped, suspended in something I didn't understand. At the peak, I could see beyond the treetops, the endless stretch of wilderness surrounding the forgotten amusement park. Then the wheel stopped, leaving me hanging in midair. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as I looked down. The silence was suffocating, the stillness unnatural. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. The temperature seemed to drop, and a strange feeling settled over me, as if I was being watched. I turned my gaze downward, scanning the ground below. That was when I saw them. Figures stood near the base of the Ferris wheel, unmoving and silent. Their outlines were hazy in the dimming light, but they were there, watching. My stomach clenched as I counted them 6, maybe 7, standing in the overgrown pathways. None of them moved, yet I could feel their eyes locked onto me. I gripped the metal bar in front of me, my mind racing for a plan. Then, without warning, the Ferris wheel lurched, beginning its descent. The gondola rocked as it moved downward, the figures still frozen in place. My breath came in shallow gasps as I braced myself, waiting for anything to happen. As I neared the bottom, the figures took a step forward in unison. My heart pounded in my chest, panic clawing at my throat. The gondola reached the ground and I shoved the door open, jumping onto the dirt-covered pavement. The figures stood just a few feet away now, their presence overwhelming. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the broken concrete. The park seemed endless, the pathways twisting in unnatural ways. My breath burned in my lungs as I darted between rusted rides and crumbling buildings. No matter how fast I ran, I could still feel them behind me. The exit was nowhere in sight, and my panic grew with each passing second. The shadows stretched around me, distorting my surroundings. A rusted carousel loomed ahead, its broken horses frozen mid-gallop. I sprinted past it, my mind screaming for me to wake up from this nightmare. Then, suddenly, I burst through the tree line, back into the forest. My legs carried me forward until my lungs felt like they would explode. Only when I was deep within the woods did I stop, collapsing against a tree. My hands trembled as I tried to catch my breath. When I finally turned back, the amusement park was gone. The trees stood thick and unbroken, as if the park had never existed. My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The Ferris wheel, the figures, the unnatural movement, none of it should have been real. I stayed there for a long time, staring into the darkness, expecting something to emerge. But the woods remained silent, undisturbed. My heartbeat gradually slowed, though the unease never left me. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and make my way back. By the time I reached my car, the sun had almost disappeared behind the trees. I climbed in, locking the doors as if that would protect me. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Whatever had happened back there, I knew one thing for certain. I would never return to those woods again. Story 15. The forest was quiet as I moved along the narrow trail, my boots crunching softly against the damp earth. The air smelled of pine and distant rain, the dense canopy above blocking most of the sunlight. I had been hiking for hours, enjoying the isolation, when I spotted something strange through the trees ahead. A staircase stood alone in a small clearing, weathered wood covered in moss and lichen. It had no railings and no structure it led to, just an old set of steps rising toward nothing. My pulse quickened as I approached, the absurdity of its presence making my skin prickle. As I climbed the first step, the wood groaned under my weight, but it held firm. That's when I noticed the footprints, fresh, damp imprints pressed into the worn planks. They weren't mine, and what made it worse, they were leading downward, as if someone had just descended moments before I arrived. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The forest was still, as if it too had paused to observe the unnatural scene. A sense of unease crept over me, but curiosity pushed me onward, and I ascended another step. Each board creaked beneath me, the sound unsettling in the silence. The footprints remained clear, spaced as if someone had carefully walked down, their pace even. I tried to convince myself that another hiker had been here before me, though I hadn't passed anyone all day. At the halfway mark, the air seemed different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. My breath felt too loud, my own presence suddenly intrusive. I hesitated, a sense of wrongness settling deep in my chest. I reached out and touched one of the steps, feeling the dampness where the footprints lay. The moisture was fresh, as if whoever left them had only just stepped away. A shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time I considered turning back. But something compelled me to go on, an urge that felt both mine and not mine at the same time. I took another step, my pulse thudding in my ears. The clearing remained empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard a faint whisper, just behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the forest remained unchanged. The sound had been too soft to make out words, but it carried an unmistakable weight, like something was speaking just outside the realm of hearing. My breath came fast as I stared at the staircase, debating whether to keep climbing. The whisper had felt close, too close, yet nothing stirred in the trees. The footprints still faced downward, as if urging me not to continue. I forced myself to move, climbing another step, then another. Each movement felt sluggish, like pushing through invisible resistance. The silence pressed in, the trees looming taller, their shadows stretching unnaturally. A chill crawled along my skin, though the air wasn't cold. I glanced at the footprints again, my stomach twisting as I realized something was wrong. The spacing had changed, no longer even, as if the person had started running partway down. Something in my mind screamed at me to leave, but my body resisted, frozen between steps. My pulse pounded as the whisper came again, louder this time, though still unintelligible. It was closer now, right at my ear, and instinct took over. I turned and rushed down, nearly tripping over my own feet as I hit the forest floor. The whisper followed, rising into a murmur, then a low, breathy laugh. I ran without looking back, my legs burning as I tore through the trees. The forest felt different, the path unfamiliar despite having walked it earlier. Shadows shifted strangely, and the distant rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. I forced myself forward, pushing through the underbrush until I finally saw the edge of the trail. Breaking into the clearing near my car, I gasped for breath, hands shaking. The woods behind me stood still again, as if nothing had happened. The staircase was no longer visible, swallowed by the trees. I waited, expecting something to emerge, but nothing did. The quiet had returned, though it no longer felt comforting. My heart still pounded, my body urging me to leave. I climbed into my car and started the engine, my hands unsteady on the wheel. As I pulled away, I stole one last glance at the tree line. Just for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing between the trees, watching. The drive home felt longer than it should have, the winding road stretching endlessly before me. My mind replayed the whisper, the laugh, the footprints that had no beginning. None of it made sense, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go hiking in those woods again. Story 16. The old hospital had been abandoned for years, its rusted gates and broken windows a silent testament to its long-forgotten past. The building stood at the edge of town, shrouded by overgrown trees and forgotten memories. Rumors circulated about the place. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed strange things happened inside. I had heard all the stories, but wasn't one to shy away from a good challenge. So one late afternoon, I decided to explore it myself. The first step inside the hospital felt like stepping into another time. The air was thick with dust, and the floors groaned under my weight as I moved further into the building. The dim light from the setting sun filtered through broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The paint had peeled away long ago, revealing the faded tiles beneath, and the hallways smelled of mildew and decay. It was a desolate place, forgotten by all but a few who had passed through its doors. But something about it felt alive. I walked through the main lobby, where cracked chairs sat in awkward stillness, and scattered papers fluttered on the floor. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of the old structure. As I made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoed through the deserted corridors, mingling with the distant sound of something that didn't quite belong. It was faint at first, a soft tapping, like a footstep following my own. I stopped for a moment, but when I turned around, there was nothing but empty space behind me. I chalked it up to my imagination. The building was old, and the sounds of creaking floors and settling walls were bound to make strange noises. But as I continued, the tapping grew louder, more distinct, like someone walking just behind me. Every time I paused, the noise would stop, only to start again when I moved. My heart began to race, but I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. After all, it was just an old hospital, and there was no reason to be afraid of a few noises. But then the feeling of being followed intensified. The tap-tap of footsteps behind me grew more persistent, and this time I could feel the air change. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. But once again, there was nothing, just the empty corridor stretching out before me. I stood there for a few moments, trying to steady my breath, but the strange feeling refused to leave. I moved on, this time faster, my footsteps growing louder in my ears. The hallway twisted and turned, each room more decrepit than the last. Broken windows let in a cold breeze, and dust swirled around in the air, giving everything a ghostly, almost surreal quality. Yet no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The footsteps were there, just behind me, always one step away, never too far. At one point, I entered a room that had once been a nurse's station. The walls were lined with old cabinets, their doors hanging off their hinges. The floor was littered with shattered glass from broken light fixtures, and the remnants of hospital equipment were scattered haphazardly. But what caught my attention was the sudden silence. The tapping had stopped. It felt unnatural, like the building itself was holding its breath. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. But again, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself that it was just the eerie nature of the building, that my nerves were playing tricks on me. But something in the back of my mind kept urging me to leave. Still, I pressed on, determined to explore further. I made my way down another hallway, the walls growing darker as the daylight began to fade. The temperature seemed to drop even more, and my breath came out in visible puffs. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but this time they were closer, almost right behind me. I spun around in a panic, my flashlight flickering as I searched the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was nothing there, nothing but the empty hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my mind racing. I was just being paranoid. It was just the building settling, I told myself. But then I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. At the far end of the hallway, there was a shadow, a figure standing motionless, just barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for something. My legs felt like lead, and I took a step back, the footsteps behind me growing louder again. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned, running in the opposite direction. As I sprinted down the hallway, the footsteps followed me, echoing in the empty space. It was as if whoever or whatever was behind me was gaining on me with every step. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the sound of breathing, shallow and rapid, just over my shoulder. My mind raced, and I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I ran. The building seemed to stretch on forever, the hallways never ending. No exit in sight. Finally, I burst through a door, finding myself back in the lobby, panting and out of breath. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, my eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing there. The footsteps had stopped, the silence of the hospital settling back in. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm myself, my heart still racing. I had no idea what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I quickly made my way to the exit, my hands shaking as I pushed open the rusted doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The quiet of the outside world felt like a relief, and I didn't look back once. The hospital loomed behind me, dark and silent, but something inside it had followed me, and I knew that I would never forget the feeling of being watched in that place. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I would never set foot in that building again. Some places are best left untouched, and the old hospital was one of them. Story 17. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a forgotten dirt road, its weathered frame leaning against the weight of time and neglect. I had driven past it several times, always intrigued by the stories I'd heard from locals about its abandonment. The house had been empty for years, and people rarely spoke of it. But on a quiet afternoon, When curiosity gnawed at me too strongly to ignore, I decided to explore. The front gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the overgrown yard seemed to swallow the sound. The porch sagged under the weight of years without upkeep, the once pristine white paint now peeling and faded. I stepped carefully onto the porch, avoiding the loose boards, and tried the front door. Surprisingly, it gave way with a soft groan, opening to a dark, musty interior. Dust hung in the air like fog, and old furniture lay scattered, half covered with sheets. I moved through the house slowly, taking in the decaying wallpaper, the empty rooms, and the sense that something had been left behind, waiting for someone to find it. It felt eerie, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for its story to be told. The more I explored, the more I felt as if the walls themselves had secrets they were unwilling to share. The house seemed frozen in time, as though the last family to live there had simply vanished without a trace. I made my way toward the back of the house, where a small room caught my attention. It was tucked away behind a thick curtain of cobwebs and dust. Something about the room felt different from the others, like it had been deliberately closed off. The air inside was cooler, heavier, as if it had been untouched for decades. As I scanned the room, my eyes landed on an old, rusted safe tucked against the far wall. It stood out like an oddity, its metal frame covered in layers of dirt and grime. I was intrigued. The safe was large, built into the wall like it had once been an important fixture of the house. It seemed out of place in a room that looked forgotten by time. I approached it cautiously, inspecting the surface. The handle was rusted, and the dial felt stiff under my touch. After a few moments of trying different combinations, I finally heard the faint click of the lock disengaging. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the contents inside. At first, I saw nothing but old papers and dusty trinkets, things that seemed too mundane to be of any real interest. But then, under a pile of brittle, yellowed envelopes, I found something that caught my breath: a single photograph, folded carefully in half. I picked it up gingerly, brushing off the dust. The photograph was old, its edges worn and creased, but the image was still clear enough to make out the faces of a family. They stood in front of the very house I was standing in, their smiles frozen in time. The family in the photograph looked happy, well-dressed, with two children standing beside their parents. It was a striking image, but there was something unsettling about it. The house in the picture was in much better shape, the lawn trimmed and the porch freshly painted. Yet, the people in the photo seemed strangely out of place, as if they didn't quite belong. It felt like a glimpse into a past that had been hidden away for too long. I turned the photograph over, hoping for some kind of clue, but there was nothing written on the back. No names, no date, just the image of that family standing in front of a house that no longer resembled the one in the photo. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease wash over me. Who were these people? And why was this photograph the only thing left behind in the safe? As I sat there, staring at the photograph, I heard a faint sound behind me, a creaking, like the house itself was shifting, as though it were awakening. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was still and silent, the only sound the slow ticking of my watch. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sense of dread filled the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I carefully placed the photograph back in the safe and closed the door, locking it again. The room felt too heavy now, too full of history that I wasn't sure I was ready to understand. As I made my way back through the house, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching me. The feeling of being followed persisted, but each time I turned around, there was nothing there. I left the farmhouse in a hurry, closing the door behind me with more force than I intended. My heart was pounding in my chest as I walked back to my car. The photograph still burned into my mind. What had I found? Why had the family left nothing but that one image? It was as though they had been erased from time, their presence in the house only marked by that single, haunting photograph. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph and the eerie silence that had surrounded the house. I tried to find out more about the family in the picture, but there were no records of anyone living there. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, and no one seemed to know anything about the people in the photograph. The locals only spoke in whispers when I asked, and their eyes would shift nervously, as if they were afraid to say too much. I began to feel like I had uncovered something I wasn't meant to find. Every time I looked at the photograph, I felt a strange pull, as if the family in the picture was calling to me. I returned to the farmhouse several times after that, but each time the house seemed emptier, more desolate, like it had been drained of life. The photograph remained locked away in the safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to be found. Now, when I look at the photograph, I can't help but feel a connection to those people, even though I know nothing about them. The house still stands, its walls crumbling and its secrets buried deep within. I wonder if the family is still there, waiting for someone to remember them, or if the photograph is all that remains of a story that was never told. The only thing I know for certain is that I will never forget what I found in that old safe, the image of a family, standing in front of a house that had long since been forgotten. Story 18. We had heard the stories about the abandoned hotel for years, tales of strange noises, people disappearing, and rooms that never seemed quite right. It had stood at the edge of town, an imposing, forgotten relic of a time long past. No one dared go near it, not even the most seasoned thrill seekers, but a sense of adventure mixed with reckless curiosity had us standing at the front door one chilly evening. There were 5 of us, all equally eager to uncover the truth behind the rumors, though none of us could shake the feeling that something was off the moment we crossed the threshold. The hotel's lobby was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from our flashlights as we fanned out into the building. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled stale, like dust and mildew. The floorboards creaked under our weight, sending unsettling echoes down the dark hallways. As we moved deeper into the hotel, the feeling of isolation grew stronger, but so did our determination to explore every corner of the place. We made our way up to the 2nd floor, where the rooms were tucked behind heavy, weathered doors. Most of the doors were either open or simply jammed shut, revealing the ruin within: broken furniture, cracked mirrors, and empty walls. But as we turned down one hallway, we found something that made us stop. A door that was locked from the inside, its handle cold and unyielding when we tried to turn it. It was odd, the rest of the hotel seemed to be in varying stages of decay, but this particular room appeared untouched. Intrigued, we moved on, but the locked door wasn't the last oddity we encountered. We found another door down the hallway that also seemed to be locked from the inside, and then another. It was as if someone had deliberately secured these rooms, keeping whatever or whoever was inside from getting out. There was no sign of forced entry, and yet the doors refused to budge. With each new discovery, our unease grew, but we couldn't help but wonder why someone would go to such lengths to keep us out. The strangest part came when we decided to try a few of the rooms that were unlocked. The first few were nothing out of the ordinary: dusty sheets, broken furniture, and remnants of old belongings scattered around. But as we pushed open one more door, something caught my eye. The bed was made, the sheets fresh and crisp, as if someone had just recently checked out or checked in. It was impossible. The hotel had been abandoned for years, and no one had been inside for as long as anyone could remember. I called over to the others, and they gathered around the bed, equally perplexed. How could the sheets be so clean? How could they be so new? We inspected the rest of the room, but there were no signs of anyone being there recently. No suitcases, no bags, no personal items. It was just a room that looked like it had been prepared for someone, as if it were waiting for a guest who never arrived. We couldn't make sense of it, but the unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach only deepened. We moved to the next room, hoping it would provide some answers, but when we opened the door, we were met with the same sight: fresh sheets, perfectly made, as if someone had just cleaned the room. This time there were faint footprints on the floor, leading from the bed to the bathroom. It was the smallest of details, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. We had all heard about the hotel's mysterious past, but none of us had expected to find something so bizarre. We decided to explore further, moving deeper into the hotel's heart. The hallways stretched on endlessly, the silence broken only by the soft shuffle of our footsteps. Every corner we turned seemed to lead to another locked room or another room with fresh sheets. Each discovery felt more unnerving than the last, and we began to feel as though we weren't alone in the hotel, even though we hadn't seen a single other person. Eventually, we made our way to the top floor, where the air was thick with dust and the windows were covered with grime. The atmosphere was oppressive, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. But there was something different about this floor. Unlike the other floors, the rooms here were completely intact, as though they had been preserved by some unseen force. The doors weren't just locked, they were sealed shut, as if the hotel was protecting its secrets from the outside world. We found a stairwell leading up to a small attic space, and though it seemed like an unlikely place to find anything of interest, our curiosity drove us forward. As we reached the top of the stairs, we noticed a heavy door at the far end of the room, its hinges rusted with age. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on us as we approached it, but none of us dared to back away. We pried it open, revealing a small, windowless room that was dimly lit by the faintest sliver of light from a crack in the wall. Inside the room, there was nothing but a single chair in the center, and in the chair, there was a notebook. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but as I opened it, I found scrawled entries in jagged handwriting. The entry spoke of waiting for someone to come, waiting for the hotel to wake up. The final entry read, "They're here. They've come back." The last few pages were blank, as if the writer had simply stopped. We stood in silence, the weight of the words sinking in. It was as if the hotel had a life of its own, a presence that refused to let go of its past. As we turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room, a shadow, fleeting and out of place. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest as I led the others back down the stairs, the notebook still clutched in my hands. When we finally left the hotel, the air outside felt impossibly fresh and clean, as if we had stepped out of one world and into another. We never spoke of the hotel again, though none of us could forget what we had seen: locked rooms, fresh sheets, and the chilling sense that someone or something was still waiting inside. The hotel remained, standing silent and forgotten, its secrets sealed away behind its crumbling walls. Story 19. I was photographing an old, abandoned factory that had been sitting untouched for decades. It was one of those places that fascinated me: the peeling paint, rusted machinery, and crumbling brick walls that told a story of better days long gone. The air inside was thick with dust, and the silence was oppressive. broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I had come to capture the decay, to immortalize the remnants of a past life, but I didn't expect to find what I would soon uncover. I had spent hours exploring the upper floors, taking photos of the broken windows and the forgotten tools scattered across the floor. Each room I entered seemed to be more desolate than the last, as though time had stripped away any trace of life that had once occupied the space. As I made my way down a long corridor, I came across a door that was different from the others. It was an old wooden door, and the paint had chipped away to reveal the weathered wood beneath. What caught my attention wasn't the door itself, but what was beside it, a small table with a single object on top. The object was a key. It was old, its metal tarnished by years of neglect, but it looked like it hadn't been there long. I glanced around the hallway, feeling a strange unease settle over me. The key was just sitting there, as if someone had placed it there recently. I couldn't understand why it would be left out in the open like that, especially in a place that had been abandoned for so long. My curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out to pick it up. As soon as my fingers wrapped around the cold metal, I felt a sudden gust of wind rush past me, as if something invisible had swept through the hallway. The air turned icy in an instant, sending a chill down my spine. I looked around, but there was no open window or door to account for the sudden breeze. The factory was sealed tight. There was no way for the wind to get in. My heart began to race as I stood there, holding the key, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The key felt heavier in my hand now, as though it carried some unseen weight. I looked down at it, noticing the intricate design etched into the metal, but there was no tag or label to indicate what it might open. It was just an old, rusted key with no obvious purpose, but my gut told me it wasn't just some random object. There was something about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The factory had a history, a dark one, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this key was somehow connected to that past. Without thinking, I turned to the door beside me and inserted the key into the lock. It clicked with an unsettling sound, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the basement. I hesitated at the threshold, staring into the inky blackness below. The cold wind I had felt earlier seemed to be emanating from that darkness, as though the basement itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to enter. My fingers tightened around the key, but I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. I had come this far. I had to know what was down there. I took a deep breath and stepped into the stairwell. The air grew colder the further I descended, and the dim light from my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The steps creaked under my weight, and I could hear the faint sound of something dripping water, maybe, or something else, but I couldn't tell from where. As I made my way down, the temperature dropped even further, and a sense of dread settled over me. The factory had felt eerie, but this basement was different. It felt alive in a way that was impossible to explain. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, cluttered room. The walls were lined with rusted metal shelves, some of which were tipped over or missing entirely. Old, broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. But what caught my attention was something in the far corner of the room, a large, rusted metal door, just like the one I had opened upstairs. This door, however, had no handle or visible lock. It was a massive, imposing thing, its surface covered in layers of dust and grime. I felt a strange compulsion to approach it, even though every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around and leave. The key in my hand seemed to pulse, as if it were urging me forward. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I did, the cold air seemed to grow even more intense. I reached out and tried the key in the lock. To my surprise, it fit perfectly, and the door swung open with a low, grating groan. Beyond the door was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with forgotten remnants, papers, broken glass, and discarded objects. But there was something else in the room that made my stomach drop. In the center of the room, sitting in a corner, was an old, wooden chair. The chair was positioned so that it faced the wall, as though someone had been forced to sit there and stare at nothing for an eternity. I stepped into the room, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to take it all in. The chair was empty, but it felt wrong. The air around it seemed heavier, as though it had been saturated with memories of whoever had sat there. I noticed a faint stain on the floor, dark and dried, like something had been spilled or, worse, left behind. A chill ran through me, and I felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. I backed toward the door, but before I could turn to run, I heard something soft, almost imperceptible. It was a whisper. I spun around, but the room was empty. There was nothing there, not even a movement. My pulse quickened as I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The whisper had come from the chair, or perhaps from the darkness surrounding it, but there was no one there. Just the air, heavy and oppressive, closing in around me. The key in my hand felt hot now, as if it had absorbed the energy of whatever was lurking in this room. I didn't look back again as I hurried up the stairs, the heavy door slamming shut behind me. The air was still cold, but as I stepped out into the factory's dim light, I felt the oppressive weight lift. I didn't understand what had happened in that basement, but one thing was clear. I wasn't the first person to discover the key, and I wouldn't be the last. The factory had secrets, ones that were far older and darker than I could ever have imagined, and it seemed it was never truly abandoned. Story 20. I was walking through the old mansion, its creaking wooden floors groaning under my feet as I explored the decaying remnants of its past. The air inside was heavy with dust, and the scent of mildew lingered in every corner. Each room seemed frozen in time, with shattered mirrors and tarnished silverware scattered about. The mansion, abandoned for decades, had a strange pull on me, as though it were waiting for something or someone to uncover its secrets. As I wandered through the endless halls, I came across a door that I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away behind a faded tapestry, its edges chipped and worn. The door stood out not because of its appearance, but because it seemed to beckon me. It was odd most of the mansion was covered in layers of grime, but this door appeared strangely untouched, as if it had been waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment before reaching for the doorknob, wondering what lay beyond. When I turned the knob, it creaked open with a protesting squeal, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into complete darkness. The air that poured out from the depths was cold, almost unnatural, sending a shiver down my spine. I stood at the top for a moment, unsure, but curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me with an eerie finality. The only sounds were my footsteps on the wooden stairs, echoing off the walls as I descended deeper into the mansion's hidden depths. The further I went, the darker it became, until I could no longer see my hand in front of my face. The air grew even colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling a strange unease crawling up my spine. My heartbeat quickened with each step, the silence around me so thick it felt suffocating. I had the odd sensation that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of my senses. But I pressed on, unable to shake the feeling that I was nearing something important. Finally, I reached the bottom, where the staircase opened into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, unused furniture, dusty chairs, tables, and bookshelves that had long since fallen into disrepair. It was as though time had simply forgotten this place. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and the furniture was covered with sheets, giving the room a ghostly, abandoned feel. But what caught my attention was something far more curious. In the far corner of the room, a single candle flickered, casting a soft, trembling light that seemed to defy the oppressive darkness around me. I stepped closer, my feet dragging in the thick layer of dust on the floor. The candle was the only source of light, its flame barely surviving in the still, cold air. As I reached out to examine it, I noticed something strange. The candle didn't seem to be melting. The wax was pristine, almost as though it had just been lit moments ago. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively glanced around, expecting to find someone watching me. But there was no one. Only the candle, flickering in the stillness of the room. My eyes wandered around the room, taking in the forgotten furniture and objects that lay abandoned. The furniture, though old, seemed oddly well preserved for having been left behind for so long. The sheets that covered the chairs and tables were not completely covered in dust, as if someone had been cleaning them recently, or perhaps they had just been used. I felt a strange pull toward the center of the room, where a dusty old armchair sat. It looked as though it had been placed there purposefully, as though it were waiting for someone to sit in it. As I moved closer to the armchair, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and I began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It was a sensation I couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though it were suffocating me. I could hear the faint sound of whispers, distant and unintelligible, just at the edge of my hearing. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the house were speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. I reached the armchair and paused, my hand hovering over the dusty fabric. There was something deeply unsettling about the chair, something about its position in the room. It seemed out of place, like a piece of furniture that had been waiting for someone to return and claim it. As I touched the armrest, a sudden, sharp creak echoed from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The room remained as still as ever, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room. The candle's flame flickered violently for a moment, as if caught in a gust of wind, but the air around me was still. I reached for the door, desperate to leave, but it wouldn't open. I tried again, pulling on the handle, but it refused to budge. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was trapped in a room with no way out. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost hear the words now. "You shouldn't have come," they seemed to say, a cold, hollow voice that echoed through my mind. Panic set in, and I backed away from the door, my mind racing for a way to escape. But the room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in as the shadows deepened. The candle, still burning brightly, cast long, eerie shadows across the room, distorting the shapes of the furniture. In that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The furniture wasn't just old and unused, it was placed there intentionally. The sheets covering the chairs and tables weren't just dust covers, they were carefully arranged, as if someone had been expecting me. The armchair wasn't just a piece of forgotten furniture, it was waiting for someone to sit in it. And now I was that someone. My fingers trembled as I reached for the chair again, but before I could touch it, the whispers stopped. Suddenly, the candle flickered out, plunging the room into complete darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for the door again, and this time it opened. I didn't wait to see if anything followed me as I ran up the stairs. the cold air biting at my skin as I left the room behind. When I reached the top, I slammed the door shut, breathing heavily, my body drenched in cold sweat. I turned to look back at the mansion, its windows dark and empty. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but one thing was certain: I would never return.